Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we'll be taking a look at 5 simple React tips that you can add to your toolkit. None of these should be considered rules or official conventions, but they are conventions that I like to stick to when writing React code. For the purposes of this demonstration, I've created this demo component which takes some props, has some state, and renders a user form component. We are passing props to the user form, which include the state value and the state setter. The rest of the props passed down are taken from the props passed into this demo component. You can see there is a lot of repetition with the passing of these props. We have the word props being repeated several times, and most of the prop names are the same as the keys that are being passed in. For example, first name is taking props.firstname and so on. To avoid this repetition, we can simply pass the props we have received directly into the component using the spread operator. We spread the props object directly into the user form component, and we avoid almost all of the repetition. However, we now have no way of knowing what props are being passed into the user form component unless we are using TypeScript or enforcing prop types, or unless we find the parent component that is passing these props into our demo component here. If our component received more props than we need to pass to user form, simply spreading the props object into user form would mean that we are passing more props than necessary. So we can move to the approach as seen here, where we destructure the props object, and then we create a new object called user form props. In here, we pass all the relevant destructured props and add isShowingDetails using object shorthand, as everything in this object is named as the user form component expects it to be named. We can then spread this object into user form. Because user form expects the state setter to be called onShowDetails, we can't use object shorthand, and we stick to passing setShowDetails into user form as onShowDetails. Now, in this example, we have created an object, assigned it to the variable user form props, and then use that variable to spread the object into the user form component. However, we are only using this object in one place, and therefore it's not necessary to assign it to a variable at all. We can create and spread the object directly into the user form component. In my opinion, this is the cleanest and easiest to follow method, as you minimize repetition whilst also making it clear exactly what is being passed into your component. Now, I have 4 more tips for you, but unfortunately this video can't progress any further unless you subscribe to my channel and hit the like button. Yeah, okay, obviously that was a lie, but you'd be really helping the channel out if you could do one or both of those things anyway. Okay, on to tip number 2. In this example, you can see we have a component that takes a user ID prop and a useEffect that watches for any changes to the user ID prop. In turn, the user effect calls getUserDetails, which uses this prop to call an API and fetch some data. There's nothing wrong with this implementation, but what if at some point new props are introduced and are required as part of the getUserDetails function? We need to ensure the user effect dependency array gets updated to include these new props. This can lead to mistakes, as it may not be immediately evident when updating the function that it gets called by the useEffect, a separate piece of code. Instead, we can wrap the getUserDetails function in a useCallback and add the props to the dependency array of the useCallback. This ensures that the function updates anytime the props change, and then we just need to add the function name to the dependency array of the useEffect. This at least ensures that if more props are added and our function needs to rely on them, it's much easier to see the dependency array that needs updating. React is not like opinionated frameworks like Ember, which separates view logic and data logic, and therefore it's very easy for React components to become cluttered and difficult to follow. One thing we can do about this is to extract our API logic into a custom useAPI hook. In this example, you can see that we have 3 separate items of state, and we have a getUserDetails function and a useEffect that invokes getUserDetails on component mount. All of this logic is directly related to the fetching of this data and can be kept separate from the presentation. We can simplify this easily by creating a useAPI hook and cutting and pasting all of this logic directly into the hook. A custom hook is simply a React function that generally returns some items. In this case, we are returning an object. Inside of this object, we will return exactly what the component requires. Here, the component uses isLoading, userDetails, and error. If we look at how this component looks now, we've cleaned up all of the logic related to fetching from our API, and we have one line of code, other than where we import the hook, that gives us the same items that our component requires. I've already made a video on custom hooks that goes into this implementation in more detail. I'll link to it in the description below. Prop drilling is the practice of passing props into one component only for them to pass them down again into another component. This can be okay when it might be 2 levels deep, but when you start passing props further down the tree, it starts to get out of control. Here we have our parent component that passes 3 props into the child component. The child component takes all 3 props and is only using the onShowDetails prop directly. The other 2 props it simply passes down the tree into the grandchild component. To avoid this, we can use context, which is built into React. If you're unfamiliar with context and how it works, check out my video on context, linked in the description below. You can see here I've now refactored these components so that we're now implementing context to allow us to avoid prop drilling. The 2 values from parent component that are required in grandchild component are details and isShowingDetails. We create a details context object and then pass the 2 values into the context provider, which wraps child component. This allows us to then remove the props we've passed down 2 levels, and instead we can access these 2 values using the useContext hook inside the grandchild component. Now, as you can see, child component, which didn't need to know anything about these 2 props, now has nothing to do with them. When you have a complex component with a large amount of logic, it can be hard to keep a track of where everything is coming from. We can at least maintain some level of clarity when it comes to naming our event handlers. When defining a function inside a component, such as a click handler, you can name this handleClick. When passing it as a prop to another component, you call the prop onClick. Sticking to this convention will help you understand that if you see a function in your code being invoked and it's prefixed with on, it was passed in as a prop. If it's prefixed with handle, you know that it is defined inside that component. For other functions imported directly from a hook or another file, you can avoid prefixing with either on or handle. For example, if you have a useAPI hook that has a function called saveUser, you would import it from the hook as saveUser, but if you then pass it down into a child component, you would pass it down as onSaveUser. This is a convention I like to stick to as it makes my code feel more ordered and easier to follow. So that's it for now. Thank you for watching. If you found this video useful, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you're not subscribed already. If you're planning on implementing some of these suggestions in your own React code, please let me know in the comments below. Happy coding, and I'll see you in the next video.